Hello and welcome back to Podfinder. This is day 1 of the 12 Days of Xinmas, and if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I'll be kicking things off with an examination of the personal history of Old Lord Xin, the prodigious Azlanti wizard who would go on to discover and formalize rune magic and found the Empire of Thassilon. In addition to covering Xin's life and death, I'll discuss the underlying mechanics of rune magic and how it was mutated over the centuries into Xin magic. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Xin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig into the life of Xin and the founding of Thassilon. The wizards of ancient Azlant were immensely powerful, and they studied arcane magic in much the same way it is studied on Galarian today, with formal schools employing strict curriculums devoted to the study of the arcane arts. In addition to the more secular areas of focus, the Azlanti god of magic, Amaznan, was the patron of magical power and learning, and was well regarded. The Azlanti tradition of arcane study was tremendously successful over the life of the empire, and produced a large number of powerful archwizards and expert scholars, including, eventually, Aroden himself. Unfortunately, as Azlanti magical tradition developed over the centuries, it became increasingly rigid and hierarchical, with tradition and the maintenance of the power structure taking precedence over earnest discovery and learning. Azlant was very much an empire, and like all empires, its internal organizations were riddled with systemic biases which bogged them down. The wizards of Azlant were convinced of their own superiority, and deliberately avoided the study of any magical practices which deviated from their own in any way. They were highly insular, and this insularity was enforced from the top down by the most powerful archwizards of the empire. Into all of this was born Xin. Born to an incredibly powerful and wealthy noble family, Xin was a pure-blood Azlanti male, who proved even from an early age to have a prodigious talent for magic. He began his arcane studies as a child, and excelled under the instruction of the finest tutors the empire had to offer. But by the time he reached young adulthood, he found himself bored. His mind began to wander, and he soon embarked on private explorations of non-Azlanti magical traditions. By the time he was an adult, Xin had become convinced that these other traditions were entirely valid, and that the knowledge of the Azlanti wizards was incomplete. He departed his homeland for Avestan in the east, where he studied the arcane practices of the native peoples, from Varisian divination to the war runes of the Shoanti, to the crystal magic of the Avestani Selwynvian elves. He even examined the magical traditions of the stone and taiga giants of the region. Over many years, Xin delved into his studies, taking key lessons from each magical tradition he examined. He took special interest in the strange magical symbols, called runes, which frequently appeared when spells, especially arcane spells, were cast. Though these were commonly recognized as a natural phenomenon, no existing magical traditions sought to fully understand them. Xin returned to Azlant, then sought sources of knowledge more ancient and powerful than himself. He contacted mighty dragons and fearsome outsiders and began incorporating their secrets into his slowly developing thesis. He even took advantage of the knowledge he had known as the heir of a powerful family by seeking out the secret veiled masters and trading secrets with them. Finally, he took up the faith of Lissala, the lesser goddess of runes, and pored over her teachings. During this time, Xin was a strong advocate for a more open curriculum in Azlanti magical education. He encouraged his fellow wizards to broaden their studies and incorporate the teachings of non-Azlanti sources into their practices. His demonstrable arcane power, coupled with his own natural charisma, made his arguments quite convincing, and he soon attracted a substantial following among his fellow Azlanti. Xin insisted that the magical traditions he studied in Avestan should be considered equal to the Azlanti tradition, and proclaimed that the peoples of Avestan and beyond were entirely capable of matching or even surpassing the archmages of Azlant. As you might expect, Xin's growing popularity drove a wedge between him and the staunchly traditionalist and incredibly racist Azlanti ruling class. Before moving on, though, I should clarify that, upon returning to Azlant, Xin made a surprising discovery. The magics of the Veiled Masters ran far deeper than the Archwizards of Azlant thought, and they pulled the strings of the Empire far more deftly than he had ever been taught. Luckily, this would never become important. Jokes aside, the extent to which Xin was aware of the influence of the Algolthu Veiled Masters on Azlanti society is unclear. While several sources claim that the mightiest and most learned scholars of Azlant and the heads and heirs of the most noble families either suspected or knew the extent of the Algolthu control, Xin himself was still relatively young at this time, and his focus on external magical traditions would have likely prevented him from becoming too involved with the halls of Azlanti power. At the very least, he likely didn't fully understand just how enmeshed the Veiled Masters were within the power structure, though he probably knew enough to be wary of their involvement in the empire he would eventually found. That said, at least one Veiled Master took specific interest in Xin, and likely pushed him forward on his path to eventual exile. The divide between Xin and the Archwizards of Azlant continued to grow, until it finally reached a breaking point in -6533 AR, when Xin finally admitted that he had traded the secrets of Azlanti wizardry to the peoples of Avestan in exchange for knowledge of their own practices. Their patience at an end, the rulers of Azlant issued an ultimatum. Xin and his followers could abandon their research and return to good standing in Azlanti society, or they could be exiled. But for the Archwizard and his devoted servants, this was no choice at all. Xin and his most loyal retainers and assistants departed their homeland, determined to establish a nation of their own, where they might explore their magical learning in peace. In total, they numbered in the thousands. In need of a home, Xin chose to return to the place where he had made his earliest discoveries regarding magical runes, Avestan. He elected to lead his followers to the southern Avestani coast, a journey which would take no less than 3 years. Arriving in their new home, the followers of Xin declared a new nation for themselves, Thassilon, an empire where magic could be studied and understood in all its facets. Xin was named the leader of this new empire, and was given the title the First King. Notably, prior to his exile, Xin took the opportunity to plunder his family vault of treasures. He stole numerous priceless artifacts, including a multifaceted crystal which originated from the depths of the Dark Tapestry, and had been presented to his family by one of the Veiled Masters centuries before. Put a pin in that. It will come up again later. The Thassilonians quickly took up the work of nation-building. While many sources on Galarian would claim that Thassilon under Xin was a benevolent empire, this initial colonization was anything but. After landing in Avestan and establishing the city which would become Xin Bakrakhan, the Thassilonians proceeded to expand along the coast before turning inland. To the north, they conquered the lands which would become Edasiril and Cyrusian. From there, they turned inland and took over the lands which would become Bakrakhan and Shalast. The occupants of these lands, the Shoanti and the ancestors of the modern Varisians, often resisted this expansion, but Thassilon's military and arcane might proved difficult to defeat. Make no mistake, this was a conquest, pure and simple, with all the violence that term entails. Sometimes, though, the Thassilonians simply brought with them overwhelming economic power, driving their humanoid neighbors to submit to the empire willingly in pursuit of prosperity. The giants of Avestan proved more difficult to conquer, of course, but they too would eventually fall. I'll get into the mechanics of the domination of the giants later in this series. Besides the giants, the elves of the Miarani forest resisted conquest by their new neighbors for many centuries, and their independence was maintained all the way until Earthfall and the collapse of the Thassilonian Empire. Despite this not insubstantial resistance, Xin and his apprentices had soon established the land of their dreams. Their new nation gave them what they wanted most, an opportunity to delve deeper into their studies and theories than ever before. Xin and his scholars embraced this newfound freedom, taking up their studies with renewed vigor, and this effort would soon bear fruit. The Principles of Rune Magic. For 29 years, Xin and his top apprentices toiled away, conducting experiments and refining their theories. Without the oppression of the Azlanti traditions, they had even more opportunities to study the local magics practiced in Avestan, leading to an even greater understanding of the underlying mechanics of magic. Finally, in -6501 AR, Xin revealed his new arcane thesis to the world: Rune Magic. Rune magic sought to categorize all spells into subdivisions, called schools. Each school was represented by a single rune. In this context, the word rune refers to an arcane symbol which corresponds to a word or idea. Runes are a naturally occurring phenomenon within the Pathfinder campaign setting, and appear around a spellcaster whenever a spell is cast. Runes associated with the act of spellcasting appear to spin about the caster's hands, or to flow along the line of effect of the spell itself as it is cast, and usually form from glowing light before fading as the spell is complete. Many in-universe scholars on Golarion posit that runes are the letters of the alphabet of creation, or perhaps the building block words of creation's own language. The arrangement of these letters and words is akin to forming a sentence, a command for creation itself. Rune magic, then, is the study of how to form these commands. While rune magic is specifically a study of arcane magic, runes can form around spells cast by any spellcasting tradition. That said, artistic depictions from Paizo of divine or primal casters depict runes as part of their spellcasting with less regularity than their arcane counterparts. Occult casters, mostly bards, are shown with runes fairly frequently, while arcane casters, and especially wizards, are shown with runes the most often. This might be artistic license, or it might be an indication that spellcasting from other magical traditions simply results in the creation of runes less frequently than casting from the arcane tradition. Rune magic was a direct study of these runes, and an attempt to translate individual runes and understand the specific meanings behind each one. The thesis made several notable observations. Probably the least consequential of these, for our purposes at least, was the understanding that each spellcaster would produce a unique-to-them set of runes each time they cast a spell. This set, called a rune signature, was dependent on many factors, including the caster's personality, their baseline mental state, their history and background, and even the nature of their magical education and area of focus. It's unclear if the signature could change over time, though it seems likely. It is also implied that this signature would change slightly depending on which spell was being cast, sort of like how a person's voice can be unique to them and identifiable, but they can use it to form different words. The far more interesting facet of rune magic, however, was its assertion that all spells, even spells from non-arcane magical traditions, could be categorized into 8 divisions, 8 schools of magic, based on which fundamental rune was associated with the casting of the spell in question. The fundamental rune of a spell is the rune which all other runes in the spell are built around, and the presence of this rune across multiple spells regardless of an individual caster's signature is what allowed the spells to be grouped and classified. Now, I've been referring to 8 schools, but it might be more appropriate to say 7 schools plus 1. Xin decided that only the 7 primary schools, abjuration, conjuration, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation, were worthy of specialization. The 8th school, divination, was considered important, but not so much so that it deserved specific study or mastery. In universe, the reason for this exclusion of divination was Lissala, the goddess of runes. Her teachings claim that divination spells are a means of bypassing challenges, which should be overcome by other means, and therefore are not worthy of study. The meta reason for this is probably because someone at Paizo, maybe James Jacobs, wanted to associate each of the primary schools with one of the 7 deadly sins of Christianity, and needed a reason to pare the 8 schools of magic from D&D down to 7 to make that work. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As another piece of meta-narrative around rune magic, back in 1st edition, and even in pre-remaster 2nd edition, the 8 schools of magic were a mechanical absolute. All spells in the game, regardless of magical tradition, were divided among these 8 schools. So, when Xin discovered these schools via his studies of runes, he actually had stumbled upon a real mechanical feature underpinning all the magic in the Pathfinder universe. These schools were a mechanical holdover from Pathfinder's Origins as a spin-off of D&D 3.5, and the development of the Runelords was an attempt to tell a story which combined both a narrative and mechanical exploration of the game. In the modern, post-remaster age, the schools of magic have been abandoned, at least in a named mechanical capacity. This has left the story of the Runelords slightly untethered from their mechanical origins, but they remain an incredibly important piece of the narrative of Golarion. I look forward to the upcoming Lost Omens Rival Academies book, which is debuting the remastered Runelord archetype and, hopefully, a detailed look at the updated lore surrounding rune magic. Alright, back to the history. Xin and his apprentices had succeeded in their attempt to classify the spells of arcane magic by school, and had learned and developed new spells based on their understanding of the mysterious runes. As a symbol of their discovery, the Archwizards adopted a specific symbol, the Sihedron Rune. The Sihedron Rune is a 7-pointed star, which represents rune magic and the nation of Thassilon more broadly. Each of the 7 points of the star is associated with one of the 7 primary schools of rune magic, and that school's associated fundamental rune, virtue, and sky metal. I'll be detailing those virtues in a minute. A version of the Sihedron was also the holy symbol of Lissala, goddess of runes. The Sihedron symbol was incredibly common throughout ancient Thassilon, and can be found with regularity in Thassilonian ruins well into the Age of Lost Omens. Despite the undeniable magnitude of rune magic as a thesis, there was an underlying problem with it. The casting of spells from specific schools of magic created an intense surge of feeling within the heart of the caster. This surge of feeling was different based on the fundamental rune of the spell being cast, meaning that each school of magic invoked a different feeling than the others. These surges might be balanced in a universalist wizard, who cast spells from all schools relatively evenly. But those who specialized in a specific school of magic would find themselves experiencing a repeated surge of a specific emotion with regularity. This repeated experience might quickly become addictive, turning into a sort of high that a specialist spellcaster might become forced to chase. But hey, that would only be a problem if a caster were to, say, hyper-focus on one school to the exclusion of at least several others. It's not like that was going to happen very often. Interestingly, this connection between spell schools and surges of specific emotions appears to be unique to rune magic, since I have found no reference to such a connection in the magics practiced by, for example, Old Mage Jatembe or his followers. It seems that, by delving deeply into the runes themselves and using them as the building blocks upon which to construct his thesis, Xin accidentally exposed his followers to a property of the fundamental runes themselves which produced heretofore unknown effects on mortal spellcasters. Of course, Xin wasn't an idiot, at least not about this. He was the first to recognize this emotional surge, but rather than seeing it as a bug, he dubbed it a feature. Having grown up in the glories of the Azlanti Empire, Xin theorized that each of the surges associated with the primary 7 schools was also associated with one of the 7 virtues of Azlanti rulership. The logic underpinning this theory was always a bit shaky, however, and in my opinion speaks to Xin's own inherent biases. He mistakenly believed that the 7 virtues of Azlanti rulership, concepts which non-Azlanti cultures might easily consider entirely arbitrary, were somehow so intrinsic to the fabric of society and the universe as a whole that they must be associated with the 7 fundamental runes of magic. As an example of just how shaky this assertion is, I would like to remind you that there aren't even 7 schools of magic, there are 8. Just because Xin didn't like divination didn't make it any less valid as a refutation of this idea. For all his undeniable genius, Xin seems to have been really reaching with this theory. That being said, Xin did have a reason for coming to this conclusion. The 7 virtues of Azlanti rule were charity, generosity, humility, temperance, zeal, love, and kindness. The surges created by the 7 primary schools roughly corresponded to emotions which could be achieved by acting in ways in accordance with these 7 virtues. For instance, the spells from the School of Enchantment, associated with the virtue of love, created a surge of emotion which was similar to the feelings created by love, both the act of loving another person unconditionally and the understanding that another person feels the same way about you. The other schools had similar connections, which we will discuss later. By engaging in behaviors aligned with the virtue in question, practitioners could replicate the internal mental effects of having repeatedly cast spells from a specific school, and might even be able to empower themselves to cast more spells than they might normally be able to cast. With the debut of his new arcane thesis, Xin also announced the mastery of each of the 7 primary schools by one of his 7 most powerful apprentices. Keladerne became the master of transmutation and the virtue of generosity. Zirie became the mistress of conjuration and the virtue of zeal. Califesta became the mistress of necromancy and the virtue of temperance. Naft became the mistress of abjuration and the virtue of charity. Alderpash became the master of evocation and the virtue of kindness. Sorshin became the mistress of enchantment and the virtue of love. Finally, Xandergul became the master of illusion and the virtue of humility. Each apprentice hyper-focused on one school of magic to the exclusion of 2 others, and cast spells of that school with alarming regularity. Remember what I said a minute ago about the emotional surge of any one spell school becoming addictive? Yeah, that was foreshadowing. While his apprentices had devoted themselves to the mastery of an individual school of magic, Xin himself saw fit to generalize, and considered himself a master of all 7 primary schools. As a demonstration of his mastery, and as a symbol of his unquestioned power, Xin sought to craft an artifact, one which embodied all the power of each of the 7 schools. He gathered his apprentices, and the 8 archwizards pooled their knowledge. The result of their efforts was the Sihedron, an incredibly powerful object forged from sky metal. The Sihedron took the form of a rather plain 7-pointed star, with each point having been forged from a different sky metal. The points were also imbued with 1 Aeon stone each, with the type of stone varying from point to point. Xin saw the incorporation of the 7 metals and the 7 stones as a metaphor for the kingdom he intended to create. A place where people from all different cultures could come together and be forged into a whole which is greater than the sum of its parts. For those unaware, the term sky metal is the in-universe term for metals which originate from the stars or from distant planets. In total, 7 sky metals were known, a number which Xin took as confirmation of his theory that 7 virtues and 7 primary schools were foundational aspects of reality. The known sky metals were abyssium, adamantine, jesset, inubrix, noquil, orichalcum, and sicatite. The Sihedron artifact as a whole provided its wielder with fast healing, and could instantaneously resurrect the wielder from death once per day. Additionally, each point, or shard, of the Sihedron had its own unique powers, and the wielder of the artifact could determine which of the 7 points was active, or ascendant, at any given time. The Shard of Charity, associated with Abjuration, improved the wielder's physical defenses and granted the wielder the ability to cast a Dimensional Anchor. The Shard of Generosity, associated with Transmutation, improved a wielder's skill with weapons and allowed the wielder to transform into an animal. The Shard of Humility, associated with Illusion, improved the wielder's non-combat skills and allowed the wielder to turn invisible. The Shard of Kindness, associated with Evocation, improved the wielder's weapon damage rolls and allowed the wielder to summon a storm of ice. The Shard of Love, associated with Enchantment, improved initiative rolls and allowed the wielder to cast Charm. The Shard of Temperance, associated with Necromancy, improved the wielder's fast healing and allowed the wielder to instill fear in the hearts of their enemies. Finally, the Shard of Zeal, associated with conjuration, improved the wielder's ability to overcome the magic of others, and allowed the wielder to teleport at short range. It's also worth noting that the Sihedron was always intended to be wielded by a group of like-minded individuals, probably Xin and his most powerful and loyal apprentices. The artifact could be passed instantaneously from one person to another, allowing its power to be used to protect multiple people. Unfortunately, due to events which I'll cover in a few minutes, the cooperative intention behind this artifact never came to pass. As a point of clarification, the term Sihedron refers to two distinct ideas. The Sihedron artifact is the item created by Xin which he used as the symbol of his rule, not to be confused with the previously discussed Sihedron rune. As these videos go on, when I use the term Sihedron, I'm referring to the rune. When I refer to Xin's artifact, I'll use the phrase Sihedron artifact. The Rise of the Runelords. No, not that one. After the creation of the Sihedron artifact, Xin settled into his role as the Emperor of Thassilon. He ruled from the capital city of Xin, and specifically from his Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was a wonder of magic, an immense multi-level, multi-winged palatial construct which took on the appearance of having been carved entirely from diamond. Oddly, the palace actually predated Xin and his discovery of rune magic, in a way. The palace was grown from a multifaceted crystal which Xin had plundered from his family vault. The crystal was imbued with several runes of incredible power, and had been gifted to Xin's ancestors by the Veiled Master Ogonthun. Ogonthun had witnessed Xin's plundering of his family vaults before his exile, but had chosen not to intervene, so she might reconnect with and manipulate the Archwizard at some later date. Whether or not she did this is unclear. How Xin managed to work the magic of the crystal is also unclear. It's entirely possible that his studies of rune magic allowed him to activate the crystal on his own, but it's just as likely that the Veiled Masters, or even Ogonthun herself, provided him with the knowledge directly. Outside of the Crystal Palace itself, little has been detailed of the capital city of Xin. The city served as the capital of the empire, so it was likely richly decorated and the pinnacle of Thassilonian wealth and power, at least prior to Xin's death. One point to note, however, is the distinct and somewhat out-of-place architectural style seen throughout many Thassilonian cities, or ruins. While Thassilonian architecture evolved substantially over time, there appears to have always been a strong Eastern influence on the style, calling to mind the architectural features of the Dragon Empires. This might have been due to the architectural majesty of the Taotama Empire in Tian Sha, whose buildings were so magnificent that they drew the attention and admiration of Xin himself. Beyond these broad strokes of architectural style, however, we know very little about the city of Xin, its layout, or its inhabitants. Xin's political ambitions are a bit more well known. His broad goal with the Thassilonian Empire was to form a unified nation of disparate peoples who would support and complement one another. He sought to unify the exiles of Azlant, the Shoanti, the nomadic Proto-Verisians, the giants of northern Avestan, and the elves of the Mierani forest under his rule, combining their cultures, languages, and pools of knowledge into a single empire which would rival his idealized version of Azlant. To accomplish this, the first king founded numerous schools in his empire, both arcane and, more generically, academic. He also founded several monastic orders. These organizations were intended to both educate and civilize the humans of the region, and bring them into line with Xin's ideals. Of course, even for someone as impossibly powerful and influential as Xin, the goal of unification and domination was easier said than done. For 18 years, Xin worked toward his goal as the chief executive of Thassilon, and yet he was always met with frustration. In his political efforts, Xin was blinded by the same inherent biases which infected his work on rune magic. He assumed the superiority of his way of thinking, and, for all his idealistic talk of learning from the lessons of other cultures, there is no evidence that Xin ever deferred to the views of cultures or powers other than his own. He is documented as having referred to the beliefs of the Shoanti as antiquated, and privately fumed at the Verisians' unwillingness to relinquish their ancestral lands. There are definitely colonialist undertones in this chapter of Xin's story, which defiantly fly in the face of narratives on Golarion about Xin being a benevolent ruler. That said, I can't find any evidence of Xin personally resorting to direct violence to get his way with the peoples whom he conquered. He seemed to leave that to his armies. That might seem like faint praise, but it definitely sets him apart from his eventual successors. In minus 6480 AR, after 18 years of frustration, Xin finally reached a breaking point. During a heated meeting with his 7 mightiest apprentices, Xin lamented the burdens of rulership. The apprentices, led by Sorshan and Xandergul, suggested that they might take up some of Xin's burdens and act in his stead. After some initial conflict, their arguments proved convincing, and the first king granted each of his apprentices the title of Runelord. Each Runelord was then granted one of 7 fiefdoms to govern in Xin's name. Within each member state of Thassilon, the ruling Runelord would have total autonomy, and would be answerable only to the first king himself. Xin was still in charge, and could overrule the Runelords if needed, but in practice this would rarely occur. In commemoration of their status as Runelords, Xin presented each of them with 2 treasures of immense value: a weapon of rule and a Sihedron tome. The 7 weapons of rule, called the Alarakin, were intended to serve as symbols of each Runelord's mastery of their chosen school of magic, and were imbued with incredible power as a result. Additionally, Xin hoped that these weapons might also serve as guardians and companions for his students, and each was imbued with sentience and a unique personality. Some of these personalities were contributed to by the Runelords themselves, while others were apparently developed independently by Xin. I'll be covering each Alarakin in detail in the subsequent videos in this series. Xin also presented each of his students with a potent magical tome to aid in their spellcasting and studies, a Sihedron tome. These books were supposedly crafted by a powerful dragon loyal to Xin, but the identity of this dragon has never been revealed. Each Sihedron tome contained an infinite number of pages, and came pre-populated by Xin with all the spells of a given Runelord's school. Additionally, each tome contained hundreds upon hundreds of pages of arcane knowledge, which the Runelords could and would add to over their centuries of rule. These books were considered minor artifacts, and allowed the Runelords to cast additional spells per day due to the sheer amount of arcane knowledge they could easily access during their daily spell preparations. Xin was confident in the effectiveness and loyalty of his Runelords, and so felt secure enough to get back to his true area of interest, the study of magic. He was beginning to feel the effects of age at this point in the story. It had been over 50 years since he was exiled from Azlanti, and he had been at least 20 or 30 years old even then. Now well into his 70s at the very least, Xin had been artificially extending his lifespan with magic and alchemy for years. But even with his mastery of the arcane, Xin could feel age slowly catching up with him. The first king was uninterested in undeath as a solution to his problem, and other sources of immortality, like the Sun Orchid Elixir, had not yet been discovered. In an attempt to escape his eventual death, Xin first turned to the creation of a homunculus. His goal was to create a powerful living body to serve as a host for his consciousness. Unfortunately, the crafting of living flesh proved to be an exceptionally difficult task for the first king. In all of his academic and arcane studies, Xin had never met with a puzzle he couldn't solve. And yet, after years and years of effort, after iteration upon iteration, Xin was forced to acknowledge one basic fact. He had failed. He eventually abandoned his efforts with flesh and turned his attention to another area of interest: metal. Xin had long been obsessed with sky metal. His assertion that each of the 7 sky metals corresponded to one of the 7 primary schools of magic, and further to one of the 7 Azlanti virtues, meant that he instilled intrinsic value to the metals themselves. Emissaries and nobles who sought an audience with the first king often used this fact to their benefit, offering sky metal as a gift to win Xin's favor. This, coupled with Xin's own direct efforts to acquire these materials, meant that he eventually amassed a collection of sky metal the likes of which the world had never before seen. The creation of constructs, synthetic creations empowered by magic, was an old practice even in Xin's time. Azlanti traditions surrounding the construction of these non-living beings were rich even before Xin's birth, but Xin and his apprentices continued to expand upon and perfect them during their exile in Thassilon. Traditional constructs, like golems, were relatively common in the Empire, and were often used as guardians against other practitioners of magic. Another area of interest, however, one which piqued Xin's particular curiosity, was clockwork. While clockwork is still a burgeoning field of study on Golarion in the Age of Lost Omens, especially in places like Alkenstar, many modern-day studies are actually rediscovering traits of clockwork which were known thousands of years earlier, but forgotten after the events of the Earthfall calamity. Azlanti, and later Thassilonian clockwork, was exceptionally advanced, with the ability to create semi-sentient clockwork servants or soldiers, all capable of following complex commands. As a somewhat famous example, some Thassilonian libraries were staffed with a clockwork attendant, who was capable of answering basic questions and locating or recommending books on specific topics. Still, clockwork was expensive to develop, and was considered a luxury throughout most of the Azlanti period. But, in this field of study, Xin saw potential. The first king set to work. The scope of Xin's ambitions was relatively limited at first. Well, limited on the scale of archwizards. He sought the perfection of clockwork bodies, with the ultimate goal of creating a receptacle for his own mind, so he might achieve immortality. To that end, Xin did what only Xin could do. He gathered his collection of sky metals and clockwork designs and began to push the field of clockwork creation to new and unseen heights. He forged clockwork soldiers, clockwork guards, and even made a pet project of forging a powerful and unique clockwork dragon. He also developed multiple non-clockwork constructs of myriad designs, including golems. He also made liberal use of the rune-carved construct template to imbue his creations with reactive magical effects in combat. Xin often took inspiration from the semi-mechanical life forms of the Outer Planes. Of particular interest were the Retrievers, the elephant-sized, spider-like constructs of the Abyss, which Xin conjured and dissected with a degree of regularity to gain a better understanding of non-metal-based artificial life. Xin poured nearly all his time, effort, and focus into this project, reveling in his freedom from the responsibilities of rulership. Unfortunately for Xin, the world outside of the crystalline walls of his palace continued to turn, and the machinations of his apprentices, the newly appointed Runelords, were playing out on a grand scale. The Death of Xin. Remember all that subtle foreshadowing I did about the addictive nature of rune magic specialization? Yeah, this is where that becomes relevant. The Runelords might have once followed in Xin's ideals, but over time their convictions began to falter. While each of the former apprentices was officially a paragon of one of Azlant's 7 virtues, in private they had all fallen in some way to corruption. The Runelords had developed an addiction to the emotional surges created by their chosen school of magic. In theory, this could have been addressed by engaging in behaviors which aligned with their chosen virtues, but in practice, the Runelords had discovered a loophole. Instead of engaging in virtuous acts, practitioners could instead indulge in behaviors antithetical to that virtue. These sinful acts would produce similar emotional surges and satisfy the magical addiction, and, more importantly, could be used to provide a spellcaster with the energy required to cast additional spells. Critically, the Runelords found this sinful behavior far easier to perform than the virtuous alternative. The Runelords had made this discovery underneath Xin's nose, and had been indulging in sin to power their magic since before they had even been given the titles of Runelords. And, with Xin's attention diverted, their corruption deepened. Charity gave way to envy. Generosity gave way to greed. Humility gave way to pride. Temperance gave way to gluttony. Zeal gave way to sloth. Love gave way to lust. And kindness gave way to wrath. For decades, the Runelords ruled the Empire of Thassilon in Xin's name, consolidating their power and turning with increasing frequency to brutal and tyrannical methods of rulership. During this time, the Runelords were more or less aligned in their goals. They might have had their differences, but they worked together to usurp Xin's authority without drawing his attention and ire. One of their many collective efforts was the creation of the Rune Giants. I'll get more into the Rune Giants later in this series, but in brief, they were a magically created race of supergiants, capable of mentally enslaving the other giants of Golarion. This enslavement of the giants was incredibly important to the Runelords' rise to power, as the giants provided them with the perfect laborers and soldiers. This, in turn, allowed them to pursue their broader goals of forcefully integrating the Thassilonian population and constructing vast monuments and civic works. The Runelords were playing a dangerous game, however. At any moment, Xin could discover their treachery and put an end to them. For all their power, the 7 apprentices still feared the full might of their master. In an attempt to solidify their rule over the rising might of Thassilon, the Runelords planned their ultimate betrayal, the assassination of the first king Xin. Xin was, of course, dimly aware of the goings-on in his realm. As the years went on, he learned more and more of the betrayal of his apprentices, though by all accounts he didn't fully understand the extent of their treachery. Rather than respond to these events and wrest control of his empire from the hands of his Runelords, Xin chose to push his mechanical pursuits even further. He still feared the effects of age upon his mortal form, and felt that the only way to secure his final victory was to complete his clockwork construct body. Xin also redoubled his efforts toward the creation of clockwork followers, but changed his goal from study and experimentation to the creation of an army. The first king recognized the need for soldiers to help him retake control of his empire, and so began to forge clockwork soldiers by the hundreds out of sky metal. During this process, Xin's mental state descended into bitterness, outrage, and paranoia. Though, to be entirely fair, the paranoia was probably justified. This paranoia only deepened after a series of attempted assassinations by poison in the first king's meals. Unsure of exactly who he could trust, Xin eventually resorted to expelling all living servants from the Crystal Palace. He replaced them with clockwork minions of his own design, from simple cooks and librarians to a specially constructed clockwork orchestra to provide music to him and his increasingly rare visitors. Xin even replaced his seneschal with a group of axiomites who had the ability to project their physical bodies into any room in the palace. The only living beings remaining in the castle were the Shining Children. These strange beings had been conjured from the great beyond by Xin, and bound to his palace to serve as little more than light sources. In case you needed more evidence that Xin wasn't exactly a good guy, he literally captured and enslaved aliens so he could turn them into lamps. This practice was, unfortunately, carried on after his death by the Runelords of Thassilon. After years and years of toil, Xin had perfected his skills with clockwork, and decided he was ready to take the final step in his plan. He constructed his ultimate achievement, the Clockwork Reliquary. This construct was the pinnacle of Thassilonian magical engineering, and was intended to house the body and mind of Xin to allow him to achieve immortality. Desperate to complete his plans, Xin began the process of transferring his essence into the reliquary. This process was, however, incredibly energy-intensive, and forced Xin to disassemble the Sihedron artifact, his most potent defense. He even had to draw upon the magic of the Crystal Palace itself, using it like a battery and drawing power away from its many magical wards. To aid in this process, Xin also created 7 personal assistants, magical construct ooze hybrids called Meslons, which had the ability to absorb the First King's own spells and cast them again. With his new body ready, his power sources prepared, and his assistants in place, Xin began the transfer process. This, unfortunately, was exactly what the Runelords had been waiting for. The 7 Archwizards had been observing Xin's progress carefully, and recognized that the First King was uniquely vulnerable at this final stage in his plan. Seeing Xin's plan put into motion, the Runelords responded quickly. Working together, they teleported their assassin, a tremendously powerful rune giant named Shastak, into the Crystal Palace, bypassing Xin's lowered magical defenses. As Xin was putting the finishing touches on the Clockwork Reliquary, he found himself besieged by the Runelord's assassin. Though he tried to fight back, he found himself quickly overpowered. Accepting that his death was at hand and unavoidable, the first king gathered the power of the Sihedron and unleashed it upon his assailant. This power erupted into a blast which vaporized a huge portion of the palace, destroying Xin's body entirely and killing Shastak. But even in this final act, Xin laid a clever trap. He bound his soul to the 7 shards of the Sihedron artifact, and placed within them a contingency effect to trigger upon the artifact's full reassembly. The Runelords witnessed the success of their plan, and quickly arrived at the Crystalline Palace to confirm the death of their former master. It soon became apparent that, while not everything had gone according to plan, Xin was well and truly dead. The Sihedron artifact, Xin's most powerful creation, was still shattered, but the Runelords were hesitant to reconstruct it. They correctly predicted that the artifact still bore a powerful connection to Xin's soul, and that reassembling it would result in his immediate resurrection. At the same time, they lacked the ability to destroy the shards without reassembling the artifact, so they were stuck with no way to permanently prevent their master's return. Without a better option, each of the archwizards recovered their corresponding shard of the Sihedron, then departed for their home realms, ready to rule unshackled from the first king's teachings. Xin's treasures were plundered and mostly divided, but in the now-dead capital city a few things were left behind. Shastak's corpse was left to rot, abandoned by his creators, his soul left to fester in unlife. The clockwork reliquary was never recovered, though the reason for this has not been clarified. Much of Xin's 1,000-strong clockwork army remained in stasis, awaiting orders from their master which would never come. And finally, Xin himself remained. With his body destroyed, the Wizard King's soul continued to exist as an ethereal spirit, bound forever to his palace. His mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge, and his obsession with vengeance and his own glorious return would take root and bloom over thousands of years of isolation. What about Xin's Spellbook? Discerning viewers in the audience might notice that I've made no mention of Xin's own Spellbook. Xin was, by a wide margin, the most accomplished and learned archwizard of his day, and he maintained many physical notebooks and spellbooks detailing his various experiments, spells, and research topics. That said, the first king preferred to use a different method of study during his daily spell preparations. Xin made use of a series of powerful artifacts, called spell wells, in place of spellbooks. A spell well was a metal or stone disc surrounded by concentric rings of stone or metal which were carved with numerous runes. These rings could be rotated around the central disc to make nearly infinite combinations of runes to form the basis of a spellcasting formula for a practitioner of rune magic. By communing with a spell well and passing an arcana check, a wizard could prepare their spells as though they were studying a spellbook, and could even replace their already prepared spells with one stored in the spell well. Xin used 7 spell wells, each of which was dedicated to one of the primary 7 schools of magic. I have no idea how he prepared divination spells, though it seems almost certain that he did. And that marks the end of Xin, the first king of Thassilon. This also marks the end of the first video in this series. Xin died in -6420 AR, and from that point on, the Runelords would hold unchecked control over their lands. While they would remain united to one degree or another for some time, infighting and rivalry would see them all come to blows before long. The great unified Thassilon was dead, though the corpse had yet to stop moving. In the upcoming videos, I'll dig into each of the 7 sins, their schools of magic, and the Runelords which commanded them. I will also cover the most terrifying servants of the Runelords and their most powerful magical creations. Next time, though, I need to take a slight detour from my explanation of history and jump back to this channel's usual area of focus: religion. The study of rune magic would have been impossible without the involvement and teachings of Lissala, the goddess of runes. So, day 2 of the 12 Days of Sinmas will be a deep dive into her faith. See you tomorrow.